All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming in. I feel like Jared was actually maybe introducing me as he did his talk, just because I'm that private sector guy. And I think maybe I can speak to why a lot of the open dialogue has maybe happened between the private sector and professional baseball. I looked out tonight, and I think we have 9 former players that trained with us during their careers who are now either working in Major League Baseball or working in the private sector who have attended. So, I think that may speak to a little bit. It's made me feel really, really old, but very, very proud. So, first things first, I'm a coach first and foremost. Whenever I give a talk, I always make people realize that I would much rather have a dialogue with you as opposed to speak at you and have you sit quietly. If you have questions in the middle, please stop me. I'll certainly hang around and chat with anybody who has questions afterwards. In my first talk back in 2006 in Los Angeles, I was described after the seminar as a chipmunk with ADD on amphetamines. So I tend to get going a little bit quickly. If that's the case, please slow me down, ask me questions, whatever it is. I'd prefer to have that discussion with you. I think this is also a really important follow-up to our first 2 speakers, because like them, I'm a baseball outsider. I played baseball until 8th grade. I was actually more of a tennis and soccer player. I actually joke I took up powerlifting just to convince people I was actually tough. But it was a tennis shoulder injury that really led me into this world of strength and conditioning, and eventually realized that a lot of the baseball injuries that we see are very, very comparable, and there are parallels that we can draw. But I think where it's actually a really good follow-up to our last talk is, we heard seemingly conflicting but very important messages, right? Don't overcoach, but some people are just a small change away from really, really big results. So that's a really challenging seesaw to balance on, right? You want to overhaul someone because you think something's wrong and it could change their career, but at the same time, you could really mess them up. So books are never written about the guys who made big swing changes and then failed, are they? And there's probably a few books that could be written on that. Here's what I'll tell you. In our line of work, you're never going to falter if you help someone move better, right? I'm not in the business of overhauling swings, changing mechanics. Certainly we have people on our staff that do a phenomenal job on that. I'm more interested in giving people stability in the range of motion they have, finding 5 degrees of hip internal rotation that they might have missed out on, or making them just not hurt anymore, okay? That's a really, really big deal. You can't really fail when you understand quality movement and you work to address aberrant movement, okay? So when it comes down to it, when Jeff first reached out about putting this on, I was like, hey, I'll talk about 5 physical attributes of elite hitters. And what you realize is there's actually a lot more than 5. You can talk about sports vision, you can talk about reaction time, you can talk a million different things. I should talk about sports vision because my wife is an optometrist, but that's her cup of tea. But these are the ones that I came back to. Adequate strength and power, hip mobility, core control, thoracic spine mobility, and glenohumeral, which is the ball and socket shoulder joint. We can go in a lot of different directions with these. I'm going to hone in on some of these in a little bit more detail than others and glaze over 1 or 2 of them a little bit more than I otherwise would, because each one of them honestly could be a day-long seminar, okay? And this is the study that in a lot of ways changed my career. And I think back to when I first really got going with training big league guys. I trained Kevin Youkilis circa 2009 to 2012 in kind of Yuke's heyday in Boston, when every year it was a 400 on-base percentage. It was close to 30 homers. It was 100 runs knocked in. It was a top 5 MVP candidate discussion. And I'll never forget a discussion in the office. Tyler Beatty was one of our high school guys at the time. He's now pitching in the big leagues for the Giants. But Tyler's dad, Walter, basically had a job where he was often in the area during the day while Ty was in school. So he'd pop by the facility and have lunch in our building and, just come by and hang out in the office. And I remember distinctly, he went over to, Uke was in the office finishing up a training session, and he asked Uke, he said, what's the number one thing that goes through your mind when you're hitting? And, I'm, expecting to hear approach or something like that. And he says, I hit with my hands. And I'm thinking about it, and Uke was a guy who taught me a ton. He's one of our first big leaguers and became a real close friend and was a really, really important mentor in my life in many ways. And I thought about it, I was like, you think that because everything else down the chain works really, really well, right? If a high school kid thinks that, it doesn't work out really well. So it got me thinking a lot more about what's actually happening further down. How can I get better to help people so that they can get to the point where they can take some of that other stuff for granted to the point that they can become an elite hitter just thinking about this. And this is the study I come back to. This is actually a study on pitchers, but there's important principles that you can really think about as you look at it. So I've got a little pointer here, but if you look at the pitching delivery, right, this is stride foot contact. And what you see is this is the right ASIS, that's your right hip, left ASIS, okay? And this is your right shoulder joint center of rotation and your left shoulder joint center of rotation. So when we're at max external rotation, we're at ball release, these things are very, very squared up, okay? When we're at that position of just setting down into foot contact, and these parallels are drawn perfectly to hitting, just in a little bit of a different timing scenario. We realize that the pelvis, if we're talking about a right-handed individual, is rotating counterclockwise towards the plate, right? So if I start here, these are gonna end up going this direction. There's a point, both in the pitching delivery and to a lesser extent during the hitting delivery, where there's a separation taking place, right? This hip-shoulder separation. The shoulders are going clockwise, the hips are going counterclockwise. That's what creates that stretch that allows us to create subsequent force production, right? That's all well and good. It's also the thing that can get us into trouble, right? That's where oblique strains can come from. That's where that cranky low back issue can happen. There's all these different, kind of shortfalls to that. But what we realize is that getting to those positions mandates that A, you transfer force efficiently, and B, you generate that force in the right places. And for me, it all comes back to strength and power. If you guys have a chance, and by the way, I don't know if you saw on my first slide, there was a link up there. You can download all these handouts on my website. It's erickressey.com/Slugfest 2019. You can do it right on your phone now. And also that'll get it kicked to you from my email. So if you have follow-up questions, you can certainly email me. But this is something that you can get for free on the internet. Okay, it's actually a really, really good two-part, basically meta-analysis on power production in athletes, right? And part 2 was particularly good because they talk about training considerations for improving maximal power production. It's actually written by an Australian group, so not a lot of baseball, at least in 2011, maybe being frontline in Australia, that's changing. But they talked about 4 key principles for power development, right? The first one, a fundamental relationship exists, sorry, this is a little bit smaller on my computer, between strength and power, which dictates that an individual cannot possess a high level of power without first being relatively strong, okay? Strength buys you a seat at the table. All of the complex power training strategies, running agility ladders, crazy overload, underload, bat speed stuff, that doesn't matter if you're not strong or if you don't have even a base level of strength, right? And so we can debate what that number really is, but there's certainly a foundation level of strength that has been demonstrated in the research to be an important precursor to power development. Okay, the research was actually done on female volleyball players. They found that they could train power until they were blue in the face, but unless they had a strong strength foundation, it didn't improve, right? It really doesn't surprise you, right? Force is a component of power. It's just involving time, okay? So that's the first thing. What was interesting to me, this is a 2011 study. I wrote about that in my first book in 2006, okay? Consideration of movement pattern, load, and velocity specificity is essential when designing power training programs. I'm going to talk about this in a second, but power is very plane specific, right? Just because you can jump high doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to swing a baseball bat with considerable velocity, right? I wrote about that in an article on T-Nation in 2010. Right? It's vital to consider the individual athlete's window of adaptation for each neuromuscular factor contributing to maximum power production when developing an effective and efficient power training program. A training program that focuses on the least developed factor contributing to maximal power will promote the greatest neuromuscular adaptation and therefore result in superior performance improvements for that individual. This is a lesson for the tennis community. Here's what's awesome about the tennis community. They love to train as long as they can do everything on the court. Unfortunately, you can't really bring barbells and kettlebells and all those things out onto a court. So what they do is they wind up training all of the qualities that they've already trained over and over and over again. Okay, and we'll talk about this in a second, but wrote about that in 2006 as well. A key consideration for long-term development of an athlete's maximal power production capacity is the need for an integration of numerous power training techniques. This integration allows for variation within power, mesocycle, microcycles, et cetera, right? So train power differently at different times throughout the year, right? Also wrote about that in 2006. So what we realize is a lot of the things that we do in the gym, in the private sector, or in pro ball, or in college ball, wherever you may be, we learn the things that wind up being in the research 5 years later, okay? And those were a lot of basically things that I kind of surmised from what we did with basketball players while I was at the University of Connecticut from 2003 to 2005. And when I started going to the private sector, there were things that just didn't work in rotational sport athletes nearly as well. So let's talk about that. How do you build a sprinter, right? Think about this, right? On the far end, left end of the continuum, right, you have absolute speed stuff. And I've used this a bunch of times. You guys can find this on my YouTube page, but absolute speed, right? Run fast, jump high at body weight, right? You can even probably shift that curve a little bit to the left if you're talking about downhill sprinting, which some coaches believe in. And then you shift over, right? You go speed strength. I think power output's actually maximized on jump squats at about 30% of 1 rep max. Then you go a little bit further to the right, you get to strength speed. You're looking at the Olympic lifts. And then you get to absolute strength. Really, really heavy lifting, good things happen, right? So let's think about that college basketball player that rolls in on day one of his freshman year, who's never lifted a weight, but he's played tons and tons of hoops. The absolute best thing you can do, shift him all the way over to the right side of the curve, right? Hit absolute strength hard, get a really good foundation in place. You're probably going to get some body weight changes that make it even easier to produce absolute power. And then eventually you're going to realize that you can start to benefit a lot within that middle ground, right? You can train speed strength, you can train strength speed, but it doesn't really matter unless you're able to actually put force into the ground, right? What's nice though is we can take these exact same things and we can apply them to hitting, we can apply them to pitching. It's just look at where things fall on that continuum, right? If you have an untrained 14-year-old who can barely pick up the bat, you need to get that kid strong. That's really, really important, right? It's going to make all the skill development work that you do come easier to them, right? Medicine balls are probably more your strength speed in that population. Certainly you can look at things like trap bar deadlift jumps and stuff like that as being to the right of that continuum. And then maybe you even start looking at some of the underload, overload stuff to complement what they would be doing with the actual bat. But the point is that you have to work in different points on this continuum during different parts of someone's training career, right? With our pro guys, after they've gotten a lot of their strength foundation back in the first part of the off season, we kind of get to this point where it's like, all right, this guy's strong enough, right? If I have a pro athlete, one of our big league guys texted me that he pulled 495 for 5 on the trap bar the other day. I'm like, you're strong enough. It's just not worth like pushing past that. But can we benefit a lot more from shifting you over to the left of the curve, training rate of force development a little bit more often? The other thing that's really, really important to remember, if you look at some of athletic qualities that we encounter, strength and aerobic capacity actually stick around really, really easily, okay? You can go about 30 days with one exposure, and those things are going to stick around. So just ask any big leaguer who goes in and does 2 sets of 3 really heavy in season, and they preserve a lot of their strength. Aerobic capacity tends to stick around really well. Power actually detrains really, really fast. 5 to 7 days, you start to detrain this stuff. So there's a place for figuring out where guys can benefit the most from training power and then standardizing thing on that continuum. I saw, team will remain nameless, one of their players trains with us and he pulled up his app, right? So he played his last game as a minor leaguer September 2nd. We had this conversation November 20th or whatever it was, and he had not sprinted since the day the season ended. He had 4 lifts a week, and then on Wednesday he had like 30 minutes on the bike. So literally he had detrained power for over 2 months. So independent of the lost training benefits, there's also the susceptibility to injury when you take too much time off from that. So appreciate that there's different points on the continuum, and you have to help athletes find out where they fit in. This is an interesting study. So in 2009, at the end of the year, I wrote up an article called What I Learned in 2009. And it was published on T Nation right at the start of 2010. And all I put out there was, I think power is plane specific, meaning I saw a bunch of guys throwing 95 who had like 15-inch vertical jumps, and it just didn't make sense. And so I put that out there in that article, and sure enough, Graham Lehman actually emailed me like 2 days later. He's like, I saw the article. This is awesome. He's like, I actually just did my master's thesis connection on this exact same thing. He was at a Canadian university. It was published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. He found that lateral to medial jumps were consistently correlated with high throwing velocity in each of the throwing techniques in both left and right-hand throwers. This is the first study to correlate throwing velocity with a unilateral jump in the frontal plane mimicking the action of the throwing stride. What was interesting, though, is that they saw very little relationship between a broad jump and sprinting speed and throwing velocity, right? So they also looked at a med ball rotational throw for distance, which showed to be predictive. So generally speaking, transverse plane beasts aren't necessarily sagittal plane beasts, and vice versa. And any of you guys that have seen an underwhelming athlete that hits absolute missiles can probably speak to this. And we've also seen that freak athlete, for whatever reason, just doesn't sync things up rotationally. So keep in mind that training power specifically is important. And the research certainly verifies it, right? This is a great study from Jeff's alma mater, Louisiana Tech. They basically looked at different lifting groups. This is 15-year-old kids, too. And if you look at the study, the design of the med ball program wasn't particularly great, but they did 3 days a week of med ball stuff in addition to lifting and hitting in one group. The other group skipped med ball. They showed greater improvements in angular hip and shoulder velocities, bat end velocity, dominant and non-dominant torso rotational strength, and medicine ball hitters throw than group 1. It was actually double the improvement in bat speed in the med ball group compared to the other ones. So all it speaks to is train at different points along the continuum. It didn't hurt that these guys got stronger, but both of these groups improved. The med ball group improved substantially more. Okay, and that study's 2007, and we still have weight rooms that don't have med balls in them. So keep in mind that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit you can pick. How do we attack our med ball stuff? First off, we don't want to beat guys up right when they get back from the season. So if our minor league guys wrap up the first week in September, we have a lot of guys that get right back in quickly. I actually like that a lot, as opposed to kind of the classic recommendation of take a month off and hike and do yoga. I always think there's some really low-hanging fruit we can get, and most of the time off in the baseball offseason tends to take care of itself with Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's and all that. So we just limit rapid elbow extension. We do a lot more anti-rotation work. We train single leg balance. I wouldn't even necessarily call it power training, but it's 4 days a week in some capacity. And then after that first month is when we start to let it eat a little bit more. So there's about 140 to 200 total throws per week spread over 3 sessions. Usually that's some kind of rotational one, some kind of overhead stomp variation, and usually it coincides with the beginning of a throwing program and hitting. What we know is that first month of throwing is not going to be crazy stressful. Likewise, hitting, guys aren't doing stuff that's really going to beat them up. The volume isn't high, the frequency isn't quite as high, so this tends to work out really, really well with it. Once January rolls around, the volume tends to come down on our med ball stuff. We do a lot more rotational scoops, fewer shot puts. Just, you see some guys that get really aggressive into elbow extension and wind up having problems. 2 to 3 shorter sessions per week. 90 to 140 total throws, and again, everything else ramps up. So just in terms of some of the progressions, and if you guys need these videos, just let me know. A lot of them are on my YouTube page, but I'll send you the links if you have them or have questions about them. Half kneeling anti-rotation shot put. Again, thoracic mobility, driving through that front heel into the ground, so teaching people how to be a little bit stiff. In fairness, Kyle is our pitching coordinator in Massachusetts, and I gave him 0 warm-up before filming all these videos for a seminar I did back there last spring. So these are not going to be remarkably powerful or even particularly athletic, so I apologize. Split stance rotation, scoop toss. We'll get guys up, again, firm into the front leg. Motions coming through that upper back, just teaching them how to work over a braced front leg. And then obviously we can get more into shot puts and scoop tosses, which are kind of the foundation. These for us tend to be month 1 progressions. Rotational scoop toss tends to be a little bit more elbow friendly. And then what you can start to look at is how do I start creating some preloading, whether that's with a momentum drill like a figure 8, where the hips are going with the hands. Good, get a little bigger with your hips. A step back scoop toss, right? Getting into that back hip, not letting the knee wind up outside of the foot. 2-hop to scoop toss is one of our newer favorites. Just teaching guys to have a little bit of momentum forward, being more athletic. We break a lot of med balls. Step behind shot put, again, just creating momentum and some direction. Teaching guys, to be honest, a lot more of our focus is about getting into the front hip as opposed to pushing off the back leg. Double play shot put, just a chance to make things a little bit more random, maybe a little bit less blocked. So we'll do receive and release, scoop toss as well. She did this morning with one of our guys. And again, you can make the feeds a lot more unpredictable, make guys adjust, add pauses, throw harder on certain ones than others. All right. So that speaks a little bit to some of our power development stuff, and you can, your imagination is the limit with those. What I want to really emphasize on the hip mobility side of things, and this could go in a million different directions, is there's a great study from Welch back in 1995. Basically, showed 714 degrees per second of rotation at the hips. Second Chris Taylor reference of the night. Chris is one of our guys, so give him some love in here. But stride length averaged 85 centimeters, roughly 380% of hip width. That's really not extreme hip abduction range of motion. It doesn't even come close to what we really encounter in sprinting, even in the sagittal plane where there's a lot more hip extension. So what it speaks to is really hip control is probably a lot more important than absolute hip range of motion. When you see guys that have cranky hips, it has less to do with them being globally really, really stiff, not being able to get to positions. It has a lot more to do with them having poor what we would call arthrokinematics control, right? So osteokinematics, if you're talking about shoulder, right, there's abduction, adduction, there's flexion, there's extension. But there's a whole lot of rolling, rocking, gliding that takes place in the joints. And at the hip, we really need to control that, right? At the shoulder, we've got our rotator cuff. We get that strong. Things tend to stay nice and centered. At our hip, really, glute max is a big player, not just in terms of force production, but in terms of controlling that hip. And if you need any proof that it doesn't really necessarily take a crazy amount of range of motion to generate power, there's Blake Trinan, like That's the most relaxed 101-mile-an-hour turbo sinker ever. Mike Soroka, not extreme hip range of motion at all in his delivery. So you can be very, very successful rotationally without having to be big. And I think that's a very important message, particularly in the pitching community, but probably even more so in the hitting community, because we see more and more people that think you need extreme range of motion, right? Some of those hips that you see, they may actually be good because they're tight, right? Don't chase extreme range of motions. Think about why guys are restricted. And what we know is, though, range of motion deficits in the lead hip rotation and lumbar spine extension correlate with a history of low back pain in golfers, right? So we have to ask, why would a hip internal rotation be limited, right? It could be the joint, right? Certainly we see arthritic hips in people who are older, but it could also be a bony block if you have an athlete who's got a femoral acetabular impingement. If you look at the research, that's 100% of NHL players. It's 80% of asymptomatic college football players. I can guarantee you that over 90% of your 18-plus baseball players have some degree of reactive changes in their hip, right? Whether it's bony overgrowth on the head of the femur or it's bony overgrowth on the actual acetabulum, which will be the hip socket. So we have to appreciate that if you're trying to stretch out bone, it's not going to work out well for you, right? You're probably going to flare them up pretty good. We also have people who are retroverted. Josh James from the Astros is one of our guys. Josh has real retroverted hips, and you can see it in the way he pitches. He tends to be much more open on the rubber when he throws from the stretch. It works. It's just a unique presentation that he's figured out how to work for him. Ryan Flaherty, who retired today, is a retroverted hip. So Ryan's played in the big leagues as a super utility guy for 8 seasons with hips like that. It's just you have to appreciate he's probably never going to be a guy who's going to be like toes straight ahead when he squats. They like to turn out a little bit more. Tissue extensibility, certainly you can get shortness in your hip external rotators. You can get capsular changes. We'd expect to see that in some old athletes, particularly ones that maybe had surgical interventions. And then there are people who just from a motor control standpoint can't tap into the range of motion they have. And that's not just the hip, that's all over the place. So our first strategy is always chase the sagittal plane. It's the easiest thing to get, right? So glute activation, I love prone hip extension. If you can't do a prone hip extension without flaring up your low back or firing your hamstrings on all cylinders, you're probably not going to do very, very well. And we'll show some kind of aberrant patterns on this in a second. But you may see athletes that are this limited in hip extension. I know I see 4 or 5 at the beginning of every off season. Eventually, once people are good off the table, we'll go into a prone position off the ground. Ideally, we'd like to see guys actively well past neutral, so up to 10, 15 degrees of hip extension. And then we'll get guys up and actively get them into what we call a glute wall march iso hold. Really just a hip separation drill where he's focusing on pushing the carpet away from him on that back leg, really getting good glute activation. One of the things I would say is there's a big trend towards external focus cues in the coaching cue community. I think that's phenomenal. There are certain times where internal focus cues can actually be really helpful. Glute activation is one. Sarman's done some great research on that. And then also rotator cuff recruitment. Manual palpation of a shoulder can actually markedly change biceps recruitment compared to rotator cuff stuff. So there is a time to honestly just go up and jab your fist into a guy's butt cheek while he's doing an exercise like this. It is internally focused, but it does tend to change EMG if that's what you're looking for. And obviously sideline clam, basic exercise. We'll use these with our guys, particularly early in the off season. They're basic things. The way I look at it is a sideline clam is a way to get glute activation in the transverse/frontal plane. That's going to take care of a lot of cranky right-sided low backs in the way he's set up, right? You'll see a lot of guys that instead of getting femur on acetabulum tend to get a lot of just spine motion into lateral flexion. So the more we can differentiate those two, the better. This is a college athlete who came our way. He was a guy who consistently would throw his back out back squatting, extension-based low back pain. Here's what he looked like in prone. So that's how much hip extension he had. And then after he does that, I said, hey, get your leg up as high as you can. Show me where you go to get it. So as he comes to the top position, watch what the next rep looks like. It's a lot of spine extension, right? So you see hypertonicity through the low back. So a guy like that, when he gets into full tilt sprinting or even just finishing a squat trying to get into full hip extension, he's got to rob Peter to pay Paul. He's got to find that motion somewhere. So whenever you see that one-sided low back pain, more often than not, it's limited hip extension, a lack of control in that regard. This is another kind of little case study. This is actually a golfer who came in, and great Thomas test, right? Hip is flush with the femur is flush with the table, so he's got plenty of hip extension. But when you actually put him in prone, this is what it looks like. This is a guy who actually couldn't go for a quarter-mile walk without his low back getting really cranky. So he has plenty of hip extension. You just can't tap into it. So it's a motor control thing. And watch what actually happens on this right side. As he goes into hip extension, Notice the out-toeing. So he's got a basically hip hike, and he winds up in a lot of external rotation. Over the course of a quarter-mile walk, that's a lot of out-toeing, and that's why his right-sided low back gave him a lot of issues. So finding full hip extension, at least in neutral, and being able to control every little bit of it is really, really important. The thing I would tell you is, right, these guys don't always present the same way, right? Some of them present as anterior hip irritation because what will happen is they extend their hip with a really hamstrings dominant pattern. They'll glide forward and they'll irritate their capsule. That's your annoying anterior hip tightness. The guy stretches it feels good for 10 minutes, then it hurts more afterwards. You'll often see same-sided low back pain. You know, these are classic findings in guys who have hamstrings pulls. Your hamstrings work overtime for a dysfunctional synergist, which is your butt, okay? Looking at hip internal rotation, this is kind of my flow chart. You guys will watch a lot of like, how many of you guys are familiar with FRC, functional range conditioning? There's some really, really good stuff on it. It's probably in every major league organization at this point. The thing I would just tell you is, for me, FRC tends to be about the 6th point on this continuum. We got to clear a lot of different things before we get to it. It's a very high threshold strategy that, you know, kind of can aggressively torque people into some pretty substantial end ranges. We have to be really careful. First, we got to screen for, are there bony blocks? Is it capsular changes? Is it something else that we need to kind of work on? So we work on alignment first, and I'll just show you some of the patterns. This is called left side lying knee towards knee. In this position, I'm actively pulling my left knee up to my right one, so I'm learning to get into my left hip. It's also shifted back in. This is a Postural Restoration Institute influence drill. My low back is actually flexed. I'm kind of rounded under. So all I'm doing is I'm clearing some space at the front of my left hip, and I'm going to get there and just do 5 big, deep exhales. You'll get guys that get off the table and have an extra 10, 15 degrees of active control into hip IR. So for a lot of our guys, this is just like a pre-throwing or pre-hitting deal. All fours belly lift is another one. What we know about hips, right, is if you dump a hip forward, feet tend to go out like this, right? So when we dump a hip forward, it tends to drive hip external rotation. IR gets closed off. So when you see guys who are really, really extended, like that crazy athletic center fielder that runs a 6'3" and has 0 hip internal rotation, usually it's just a matter of finding them a little bit of posterior pelvic tilt. So if you look at this video, or actually it's just a picture, I've driven some posterior pelvic tilt just to free up the front of the hip socket a little bit. And you'll see guys that come back from this, and all of a sudden, A, the low back feels a little bit better after some positional breathing here, but B, the hip is able to freely internally rotate. Why is hip internal rotation so important? It's a mechanism for delaying external rotation, right? We use flexion to hold IR to potentiate late hip external rotation when we get fooled on a pitch, whatever it may be. So it's important to have enough IR to work with. If you're not working with a lot of IR, some guys have to go to strategies where they're maybe a little bit more open. So they're working from -20 to neutral as opposed to neutral into 20. So when you see that guy come in and he's got 0 degrees of hip internal rotation, it's really not a great place to be on your trailing leg. Okay? High tension side bridge. A lot of people from a pure just protective tension standpoint aren't able to tap into the motion they had. This is basically a short lever side bridge. In this position, he's got his butt cheeks squeezed together hard. He's got his hand on his rib cage, just kind of lock it to the pelvis. And all we're having him do is brace as hard as he can, like a 10 out of 10, and give us 3 really big exhales. This one tends to work really well for improving internal rotation in guys who maybe have some funky alignment issues. Thereafter, we may go to some soft tissue work, right? Just an acumobility ball on the hip external rotators, starting with just some hip flexion, and then you can actually work into hip internal rotation and adduction as well if you pull the opposite shoulder. Obviously, if you have access to a good manual therapist, we send a lot of guys in for soft tissue work because we've got it on site, but if you don't, sometimes working the trigger point ball or something like that can be really, really helpful. Banded kneeling glute mobs. It's hard to see. I actually see these kind of messed up quite a bit in the private sector. You'll see videos on Twitter where the band is pulling in the opposite direction. When you use a band for distraction, it should be right up as close to the crease of the hip joint as you can, and it should posteriorly pull the head of the femur, right? Most people impinge on the front, so you want to make sure the band is actually pulling it back. So what he's doing here is he's slipping into adduction, so the hip is falling outside the knee, and all he's trying to do is just find a stretch on the outside of his hip without pinching in the front of the joint, okay? If guys do well on something like this, the next step is just take the band away and see how they do without it, where all the band is doing is providing some arthrokinematic control of the actual joint. I like this a lot better for stretching to improve IR than doing a lot of knee-to-knee stretch, which can be really kind of aggressive on the medial aspect of the knee. Okay? Again, I mentioned FRC, great stuff, definitely look into it. Pails rails in an internal rotation position. It's progressive angular isometric loading, and then regressive angular isometric loading. So the progressive would be increasing the stretch. So, basically if I was in hip flexion, for instance, a progressive stretch would be on the glutes, a regressive stretch would be on the opposite side of the joint. So here we'll alternate positions of isometric activation. Again, these can be very, very high threshold. You'll see a lot of guys that are gritting their teeth and bracing like crazy. So when you have the guy who's completely strung out of their mind and really, really worked up and anxious, these may not be the best approach for it. But for athletes, particularly ones who maybe have achieved some changes in their range of motion after a manual therapy intervention or some positional breathing, these can be really, really effective for holding them. And then obviously you want to train in those positions. This is one I actually started using a lot more this year. It's a two-way step down. I'm only showing one of the ways. And all it is driving a little bit of hip adduction with a step behind. This is a 12-inch box. You'll see some guys that work up to 18-inch boxes and do it just fine. And obviously the other way would just be directly down to the side. But these are just great ways to teach guys how to hold hip internal rotation, particularly in a closed chain environment. So this is one of my favorites. The counterbalance in front just allows them to get into their hip just a little bit better. But with all that said, you got to watch for extremes, right? What are your extremes? Crazy retroversion, right? That's a really, really retroverted hip. That's probably 80 degrees of ER on a table. I have a theory on those. I think that's a lot of the people whose parents help them to learn how to walk, so they wind up dumping their center of mass forward while splaying out their feet. So if you have kids, don't help them, push them down, make them figure it out on their own. Anti-version, right? These guys are not good candidates for sumo deadlifting, right? You will make them substantially worse. We actually had a pitcher, a big leaguer actually, who got into like a big time powerlifting program in the off season, and he had really anti-verted hips. So they were doing a lot of like sumo deadlifts, wide stance box squats, and literally it chewed his hip up really, really badly. So just staying more in neutral is a much better fit for him. Watch out for crazy hypermobility cases. You will see a lot of them in baseball, right? And I'll talk about this a little bit later, there's a lot of natural selection at work, particularly in pitchers, but the research is actually pretty high on position players as well. What we know about hypermobile athletes is oftentimes they can cheat tests, right? So this is a toe touch on a guy with crazy hypermobility. He came to us with a meniscal tear as well as a previous Tommy John, both presumably laxity induced, right? His heels are on the wall and he's able to do basically palms on the floor toe touch with zero posterior excursion of his hips. So basically he gets all the motion through knee hyperextension and excessive range through his upper back, probably some elbow hyperextension to get there as well. So a lot of these hypermobile individuals can cheat your tests because they're inherently biased towards range of motion assessments. So you need to make sure that when you screen hitters, you have stability-oriented stuff as well. Excessive passive range of motion, right? This is the best way to show it, right? If you have somebody who's got a really limited straight leg raise, and then all of a sudden you can take their leg and they can go an extra 40 degrees, right? That's a window where injuries occur. We have a lot of research that demonstrates that uncontrolled range of motion isn't good. Look at any 15-year-old gymnast's spine who does a lot of back bending, right? They're gonna wind up with some problems because of their unrestrained passive range of motion, okay? So I spent a lot of time on hip because I think it's really, really important, and in a lot of ways I think that's the low back is the slave to the hip, so I'm not going to spend too much time on core control. But I do think this is a good study. And there have been some recent studies that show it's maybe not quite as cut and dry as this is, but this is back in '93. What they did was 18 professional hitters, looked at EMG analysis during the swing, and I think what's interesting was no difference in activity between the lead and trail erector spinae during any phase. There was no differences in activity were found between the lead and trail obliques. What it really speaks to is that we create power in the lower half, we transfer it through a stable core, and then we use our thoracic spine to finish rotation, okay? Again, there's a little bit more research showing that maybe there is a little bit more asymmetry in core control. This is one of the more landmark, I guess, papers on it, just because there hadn't been so much. Keep in mind it's '93, EMG research then probably wasn't what it is now, so we definitely need to look at this a little bit closer. But I think the principles are sound. If you look at Dr. Stuart McGill, who's widely regarded as one of the world's premier spine biomechanists, he's really put out there that spine range of motion is actually positively correlated with injury risk, right? If you move a lot at your low back, you're more likely to get hurt. You're better off finding that motion in other places. Where do we start from a core control standpoint? For us, back to wall shoulder flexion. Every single athlete that you coach, regardless of their age, should be able to do this, right? Can you keep your low back flat on a wall while you take your arms up overhead, right? And there's a bunch of modifiers. I've got like video of this that details it on YouTube and in a lot of detail about how we coach it and what the standards are. But this is an assessment and a test, or assessment and an actual training tool. You want to make sure that you can actually upwardly rotate your shoulder blades, extend your thoracic spine without having to extend excessively through your low back or go into forward head posture or hyperextend your knees. So back to wall shoulder flexion is a basic one for me. Everybody needs to pass it before they kind of advance. Stability ball rollout, right? Now we're actually competing against gravity a little bit harder, right? I talk a lot about a straight line from the head all the way to the knees. You'll see a lot of athletes whose hips shoot back and then the arms reach. They get a lot of extension through their low back as they work through it. Effectively, what we're learning to do is keep the rib cage and the pelvis relatively locked together in the sagittal plane, right? And why is that important? Look at an oblique strain, right? An oblique strain usually happens on the lead attachment, right? So if we look at the hips going counterclockwise, the torso still going clockwise, there's going to be a pretty aggressive stretch in that transverse plane. If I have really poor anterior core control, so the front, I'm going to extend a lot more. That oblique's going to get pulled even more so. So I've never seen an oblique strain come in who actually tested well in terms of anterior core. Anybody who's been around oblique strain guys, they're not fun, right? They can set themselves back 6 weeks with a sneeze. Pretty much everything hurts. So better, to be safe than sorry. Okay. Half kneeling rotational cable lift. You'll notice good hip extension, glute activation, rotate through that upper back, working through a stable core. Again, I'm using very internally focused cues. Those are a lot different than what we would use with other athletes. Wide stance anti-rotation chop. This is one of my favorites, where the hips are kind of blocked off, but we're learning to rotate through that thoracic spine a little bit more. The cue I'll give is imagine you're bear hugging a tree, so get as big as you can with your arc. It's kind of like moving the fat kid to the end of the seesaw. It makes the weight feel a little bit heavier, so guys have to take some load off on it. Okay. What do we know about the thoracic spine? Just look at the range of motion norms, right? You don't move a whole lot at your lumbar spine, right? And then all of a sudden you start getting up to the thoracic spine and there's a whole lot more rotation that we can work to. And obviously the vertebrae get smaller, they get differential structures. So T-spine mobility is really, really important. When you see people who are stuck here and then rotate a lot here, those are what a lot of those spine patients look like. So what do we look for? Two different things. First off, adequate thoracic extension allows for effective hip-shoulder separation to allow the arms to lag behind, right? That's no surprise. It allows your belly to be on plane. But the one that a lot of people overlook is this one. Adequate thoracic flexion and rotation delivers your shoulder blade and in turn the arm. Best way to show it's a picture, right? That's a rounded upper back driving scapular upward rotation to hit a ball out front, right? So these are important things to have. And I think we get so caught up with a lot of our athletes in focusing on crazy rotation and extension. There are actually a lot of athletes that have almost too much extension and need the exact opposite. So if you get the guy like this, by all means, like that guy needs thoracic extension. He's probably going to be terrible into rotation, just like grandma after years and years of being kyphotic isn't going to rotate well, except for my grandma. She's a badass golfer. But flat thoracic spine, right? Exact opposite. That upper back is straight up and down. We see it a ton in pitchers. I bet that 40% of major league pitchers are, if not flat, trending in the direction of flat. Don't see it quite as often as hitters, but one of these guys will often be unique presentations where their rotation just won't line up with what you're expecting, okay? How do we assess? We use the lumbar locked rotation screen. It's a great one from Dr. Greg Rose at the Titleist Performance Institute and now On Base U. They look for 50 to 70 degrees in the general pop, 70 to 90 degrees in rotational sport athletes. In terms of how we perform it, you can see from these pictures, the hand will go behind the back. That basically blocks off scapular movement, okay? And then we'll sit right back, butt to heels, and actually intentionally round the low back. In doing so, it takes away the ability of the low back to round. So all of that motion is going to come through the upper back instead. So it's a good way to kind of check. This is one of our big league guys. That's about 80 to 85 degrees of thoracic rotation, so that'd be a passing score. This is actually a pro golfer who's up over 100, or I'd say over 90 degrees. This is a power lifter, right? You don't need a whole lot more rotation. His spine is much more conditioned to compression as opposed to a lot of the demands of rotation. So different kind of elements of what you'd expect to see. You also have to look for active versus passive. So here, probably 55 or 60 degrees of active range of motion, yet I can manually take him closer to 80 or 85. These guys are enigmas, but oftentimes a little change to their pre-training warm-up can actually be life-changing because you're giving them some ability to tap into rotation that they didn't realize they had. Okay? They tend to have a lot of passive range, but not a whole lot of active range. So if you have somebody who's good actively, go ahead and train. They're doing a lot of things right? If it's poor actively, check your passive range of motion, okay? If you have limited active range of motion, but you have good passive range of motion, that means it's a motor control issue. You need to put some strength or some stability in a certain place. If it's limited active and it's limited passive, you've got to dig deeper to figure out why it's limited, right? Is it a joint issue? It may be if you have someone who's really, really rounded over, or it could be a tissue limitation. So we'll talk a little about that in a second here, but oops, here we go. So you got a lot of soft tissue structures that can impact how well your upper back rotates, right? Your lat attaches all the way down on your thoracolumbar fascia, and some people it actually attaches on the hip before it comes up and attaches on your humerus. If you get really stiff there, it's going to limit your ability to rotate. QL is another big player, right? It attaches on the bottom of your ribs, then on your spine, and then on the top of your pelvis. If you're really stiff on your right QL, it's going to be very, very hard to side bend to the left. So what are some of the clearing tests? We look at posture, we look at shoulder flexion, right? If it's a joint thing, it's probably going to look something like this. If it's a soft tissue limitation in the lats, it's probably going to look poor like this. If it's a pec shortness, which could also be a player, they might be really limited in this test. And then if it's a QL issue, it maybe is a problem with side bending. So I know this is a ton of stuff to go through. I do have another presentation online where you guys can dig through a lot of these exercises and assessments and stuff. So by all means, just let me know if you want me to send it along. But you have motor control deficits and you have range of motion things, right? So if it's motor control, right, teach them how to move better, right? Give them a band assistance. Help them work against gravity. Actively pull them up if they're really struggling to get there, right? And then get rid of the band, right? So here, more unrestrained motion. He's able to work through his upper back with shoulder external rotation. We can go to the rock back position, which makes it a little bit harder. I take away his ability to compensate, and then I go even further. It makes you realize how many guys just cheat their thoracic spine mobility drills. So make sure you're controlling for all those different variables if you're really trying to teach an upper back how to rotate, effectively. It's a favorite for me. I love using this between just like med ball drills, a bent over T-spine rotation. Follow your hand with your eyes. And then a great just adductor mobility drill. We'll go same side, give them a chance to be successful. And then opposite side is markedly different. That's where you start to appreciate that hip-shoulder separation doesn't just happen. So soft tissue limitations, lean away lateral line stretch, one of my favorite ones. If you have someone who's really stiff through QL, great positional breathing drills. Give this to your guys, I guarantee they'll like it. Sideline windmill, right? If you have someone who's really, really stiff, into thoracic rotation from a joint limitation or even just pec shortness, this can be a great exercise. Not going to be very, very good for someone who has a motor control problem. Call these bench T-spine mobs. They're as much a lat stretch as anything. Just an opportunity to get some upper back mobility. We'll usually add a big exhale at the bottom of each rep. And then you can go obviously to one arm, which adds a little bit more of an element of thoracic rotation. Sometimes you will get flat thoracic spines, bear crawl, right? And we teach our bear crawls a little bit differently, right? When that hips are a lot higher, right, it drives more scapular upward rotation, drives that rounded upper back to get into better positions. We go nice and slow, big exhale on each step. Think about actively pushing yourself away from the floor. So another really, really good one if you have a flat thoracic spine, a short plank with a reach across and under. Learn to drive motion into flexion and rotation through that upper back. We'll give it a big exhale at the end of each reach. And then straightest wall slides with a roller. Just a good chance to think about pushing yourself away from the wall, round that upper back, get your scaps to rotate around. So think about the inside middle border of your scap trying to get to your armpit. Okay. One more. All right, number 5. I could do, I think, a full day seminar on this one. I nerd out on this a lot because I'm a shoulder guy. How many of you guys have had an athlete with battered shoulder? Probably seen some. You shouldn't. To me, battered shoulder is a function of not taking care of position players' arm care. So what we know is on the lead shoulder in hitters, there's a large posteriorly directed force on the humeral head because of the amount of adduction present. So you think about it like if you're out in front, you're in a really, really good position. If you get fooled, your hips keep going, or if you're taking an outside pitch, there's a lot more adduction present. So that posteriorly directed force is going to be magnified the more your arm trails behind, okay? It was a good study from Dugas in 2012 from Andrews Institute. It's over 500 pounds of force, posteriorly directed. It's going to be magnified depending on the positions. Swing and misses tend to be brutal. Most of the time when you see a lead shoulder go down the crapper, it's on a swing and miss. Batter shoulder is either a posterior labral tear or a posterior subluxation, right? There are a lot of guys who are chronic ones that just get beaten up over the course of time, and then you'll occasionally see that guy that swings out of his shoes and goes down in a big heap. What are the challenges of the lead shoulder? First off, the way it's coached, right? There was actually a great podcast with Doug Latta where he talks about teaching soft entry into the zone. You don't want guys aggressively pulling. You want their arms to settle. So inherently, you're teaching them to be relaxed at a point where they probably need a lot of eccentric recruitment of that posterior cuff, posterior deltoid to protect them, right? So there's a timing element. They've got to go from relaxed to firing really, really quickly. So don't just think strength, think how well they're able to turn these muscles on. One-hand finishes, right, tend to be a lot harder. What we know is that when you get back into a true kind of layback position, and obviously you're not going to lay back as much as you do when you throw, that is what we call the peel-back mechanism. Your biceps tendon twists and it tugs on your superior labrum. This is why most throwers tend to have posterior labral fraying on all their MRIs when we image them. So what we realize is your posterior labrum is getting beaten up here, and then it's chronically getting beaten up here when you're a one-handed finish. This is why you see a lot of surgeons recommend guys go to two-hand finishes once they've had a shoulder surgery. The hardest ones, though, are right-handed throwers who hit left-handed or vice versa, because they get all the adaptations of throwing on top of all the stuff we just talked about. What was also interesting was a study in 1997. They looked at 61% of professional pitchers have positive sulcus signs in their throwing shoulder. That's just a gross measure of laxity. So 6 out of 10 guys in the big leagues is pretty loose. Interestingly, 47% of position players had it. So probably half of your players are prone to being unstable, right? So there's laxity, which is just hypermobility. Instability would actually be implying that there was some level of pathology that's creating it, right? A torn labrum or a capsule that's overstretched or whatever it is. So these guys are inherently loose. So there's a little bit of natural selection that probably allows some of those hitters to, be soft into the zone a little bit more than others. On top of that, you've got dives, you've got slides, you've got collisions, whether it's into walls. Big one is first baseman going up the line, making catches. That's a really dangerous position for a lot of guys to get into. So what do we do to take care of a lead shoulder? I think you look at making sure that you actually have range of motion to tap into, right? I love sideline crossbody moves. If you guys haven't used an AccuMobility ball, it's a good one. So it's basically just a pin and stretch technique on that posterior cuff. Posterior deltoid is honestly probably going to be your biggest player for keeping you healthy there. And then we look at horizontal abduction. I coach this very, very meticulously. When you see a lot of guys dropping their elbow, getting very, very lat dominant with it, they're not really getting the benefits and they're not really controlling the joint itself. So it should be a true T where the motion is initiated through the scapula and the arm kind of comes along for the ride. And I actually put this up on my Instagram yesterday after I filmed it, but side bridge with horizontal abduction or anything side lying is good because when you lower into IR and adduction, you have to essentially control right into the position. So if you can imagine the bottom of this being just like a left-handed hitter hitting a ball away, that's the amount of adduction present. And you can even progress these things. We actually do manual resistance stuff with our guys where they'll have to essentially resist from some of their weakest points. 90-90 holds, right, especially if you're a one-hand finish guy, being strong back there, so he's actively pushing back. You'll see his opposite hand is just monitoring the front of his shoulder so it doesn't glide forward. He's actively making sure that the ball is centered on the socket. Likewise, I really like rotational rows just because they do expose you to a little bit more of the horizontal adduction and abduction because the hand position is a little bit higher. You can do these down in a lower setting as well, but I do think it's important to actually condition people to get into this position a little bit with good eccentric control. Okay. I'm on social media, and my email is linked through that website as well, so don't be shy about reaching out. Thank you very much.
We got time for a couple questions.
Let's do it.
If anybody's got questions?
Yeah, within, I guess, the categories of loose movers and tight movers, do you happen to see any tendencies of other compensatory movements or weaknesses they might have?
Yes, so the thing you have to be really careful about is when you categorize people as loose and tight, a lot of your loose individuals will say they're tight. So what we know is, and I'll just give you an example, right? We all have that friend who hangs out like this all day, right? And every day he goes home and he asks his wife or his girlfriend to dig an elbow in his shoulder because he's got this big knot right here, right? His upper trap is cranky. His upper trap is not shortened, it's actually really, really lengthened. So what that is his body laying down tension protectively to basically create stability where it lacks it. So a lot of the times what you're gonna find is a lot of the people who feel tight, it's just them laying down stability because they lack it somewhere else. So be very careful about how you categorize stuff. When you look at tight movers, look for really gross changes to range of motion. Look at end feel. End feel is going to be really, really different for people who are substantially tighter than others. And usually what you find is there's a continuum, right? Very rarely do you have someone who's crazy hypermobile with that really like hollow end feel, and very rarely do you have that person where everything is just locked up and all that. And then there are different strategies you take, but in terms of tendencies, my business partner Brian has some really strong theories about these, particularly with respect to kind of pitching. One of the things I'll tell you is a lot of times when you have someone who's very, very hypermobile, they chase a stretch, right? So if you or I go down to do a vertical jump, I drop down and I kind of feel my quad stretch, I get into my hamstrings a little bit and I know it's time to go. When you're really hypermobile, you don't necessarily ever get to that feeling of like joint end range. It's why you'll see a lot of guys who are loose with really, really late arm actions. They're just kind of like waiting and waiting and waiting to find that point of tension. So a lot of times with them, you're trying to cue them away from extreme end ranges just because they can slip into those bad habits. I don't know if that answers your question. Hypermobile people are tough. They'll trick you and they'll make bad movement look really good.
All right. In regards to pelvic tilt tests, I know something, TPI and OnBase come out with. Do you feel like those tests are done, or there's too much emphasis put on like a bilateral focus, meaning like can you posteriorly tilt your pelvis backwards together, or anteriorly tilt it when in hitting? It's really about a unilateral kind of study of it, or
Absolutely.
how it should be appreciated?
Yeah, I can put it this way. I think anytime you can look at the actual hip separation, because very rarely are we just truly bilateral. I mean, there's some of that in hip, and I think some of those screens were born out of the golf community, which is more of what we would call a closed loop drill, right? The golfer dictates the swing, whereas in hitting, the pitcher dictates the swing in a lot of ways. So, I think if you can give some variability, that's important. I still think it's a good test. It's all something that, to me, that's kind of like a pass-fail, and it's a pretty low-level competency that all of our players should have. So, certainly look at that, but then also look, because pelvic asymmetry is a really real thing. I mean, posture restoration, their left AIC pattern that they describe is heavily based on that. And if you actually look at the research, Dean Somerset's had some good writing on this, is that very rarely are people symmetrical side to side in their pelvis. You'll often see people who feel a little bit better asymmetrically. We also know that ethnicity plays into it, right? I've got like Irish, English, Scotch hips. We tend to have really thick femoral necks, deep hip sockets, which aren't super conducive to having high levels of rotation and being able to squat deep. There's a reason there are a lot of really good Olympic lifters from Bulgaria, right? They have shallow hip sockets, they have thinner femoral necks. I mean, obviously that's a big generalization, but I think there's a lot of individual differences that we also need to take into account with that.
You talked about rotational med ball work throughout the off season and kind of your volume and progressions. For the professional baseball player, would you recommend in-season rotational med ball work, and would it be more general, more specific, or?
Yeah, we don't do nearly as much. I'll say that the volume comes down substantially. I'll use a little bit, to be honest, more so with pitchers, on 5-day rotations, things like that, where it's maybe a little bit more predictable. It's not one that I probably use a ton with our actual hitters. Maybe 2 sets of 6 during a warm-up on 1 lift a week or something like that, where it's almost like treated like an extended warm-up. I don't think you're going to beat up on them, but I think those guys are going to make their money in the cages and on the field. So I tend to save those bullets at that time of year. But there would be exceptions to the rule, right? If you have a guy who's just freaky strong, where maybe you do want to train a little bit more towards the speed end of that force velocity continuum. So, all right. Thank you very much, everybody.